I'm really sad to report that my overlocker is on the fritz. It's been kind of giving me some troubles for the last year or so, and I thought I just needed a new blade. I changed out the blade, it didn't help, and then I took it to the dealer where I purchased it. He changed out the blade and did a service on it, and that didn't help. And then I took it to someone else for a second opinion, and it seems like maybe there's something bent and it's basically not fixable. I'm super sad because I've only had it for about 3 years. So I'm gonna need to do some research and figure out a new serger to buy, but I'm not gonna let a broken serger stop me from sewing and stop me from making beautiful insides of my garment. So I've been kind of refreshing the ways that I can still finish the insides of my garment using my sewing machine, and I thought I would share them with you in this video. So I'm going to cover 3 seam finishing techniques that I've been using the most. And the first is probably the most similar in feel to an overlock stitch. And it involves using a overlock foot, which probably came with your machine. Mine came with mine. If you don't have an overlock foot, you can definitely find a generic one on the internet, or maybe even your dealer might have one that you can buy very specifically for your machine. But this foot is so cool. One of the features is it has this bar right in the center of the needle area. And what this bar does is actually hold your fabric taut towards with the feed dogs so that it holds it straight so you can get a nice edge finish right on the edge. The other thing that the overlock foot has is this guide. So mine is kind of in this darker color of metal, and it's just a guide where you place the raw edge, the cut edge of your fabric. You just guide it along that guide, and then the bar in the center holds it nice and tight, and that way you get a perfect seam finish right along the edge. So I think this foot is really, really cool. And the second part of this edge finish is the stitch that we set our sewing machines to. So we're going to be using an overlock stitch along with this foot to finish our edges. So the overlock stitch is essentially a zigzag and a straight stitch all in one. And this provides a nice strong edge finish for our fabric. But if you don't have the overlock stitch, maybe you have a machine that just has a basic set of, maybe a dozen stitches, you can just use a zigzag stitch and it'll give you a very similar effect. So I just set my machine to my overlock stitch, pop on my overlock foot, and edge finish right along the edge of my fabric. So the one drawback with this stitch is it obviously doesn't have the cutting mechanism that sergers do. So if you want to trim your seam allowances, you do have to trim those before. But I find that this edge finish works really, really well around curves, straight edges as well, but curves or any tricky spots in your garment. We're using like a French seam, for example, would be kind of tricky. We're going to cover the French seam next. Now for the French seam. So this is quite possibly one of the most beautiful ways to finish the interior of a garment, I think. So this weekend I whipped up a Carnegie robe using some of the vintage linens that I have picked up. So I used this one that has kind of this cutout embroidery and then along the hem as well. So I was able to use that on both of the sleeves as well as little pocket details. So I kind of was just experimenting with this robe. But I did use French seams on all of the side seams, as well as when I attached the sleeves and the shoulder seams as well. So the French seam is made up of 2 straight stitches. So we need to do a little bit of math at the start. If your seam allowances are a 5/8 of an inch, which most are, I like to sew my first line of stitching at 3/8 of an inch, and then my second line of stitching at 1/4 inch. And those 2 measurements equal my 5/8 of an inch. If your seam allowances are 1/2 of an inch, you would sew your first seam at a 1/4 inch and your second seam at a 1/4 inch. So to sew the first seam, we're going to match the wrong sides together of our garment, and we're going to sew that 3/8 of an inch. Funny enough, I actually made a mistake on this robe, but I love it. I don't really mind. One of my seams has the seam inside, and then the other side seam has the French seam on the outside because I matched right sides together on my first seam. So always just double check. I know I will be double checking from now on that your first seam is wrong sides together. So we're going to sew our first seam wrong sides together at 3/8 of an inch. Then I'm going to press that seam open really well using my iron. So just pressing it open. And then I kind of finger press it back flat to its original, how I originally sewed it. And I trim that seam allowance to about 1/8 of an inch. So sometimes I'll use my rotary cutter here, sometimes I'll use my scissors, but we're just trimming that seam allowance down to about 1/8 of an inch. Then I go back to my iron and fold that seam right sides together. And then we sew our second seam at a 1/4 inch from the edge. And then finally, you just want to press your seam again, and ta-da, you have a lovely, beautiful, luxurious French seam. I am in the process of perfecting a technique to get a perfect French seam without the bunching on a 90-degree angle like we have here on the Carnegie robe. So I'll definitely be coming back with a video once I perfect that technique. The third seam finish I want to share is bound seams. So this is actually a jacket pattern that I was working on last year, maybe 2 years ago, and I just never launched it. But this is one of the samples, and I did all of my edges using the bias tape binding. So you might have heard of a seam finish called a Hong Kong finish. This is very similar to the bound seam, but the reason why I prefer the bound seam to the Hong Kong finish is a Hong Kong finish actually leaves the raw edges of your bias tape on this side. So you would still have a raw edge between the wrong side of your fabric and your seam allowance. So for me, one of the reasons why I want to finish the insides of my garment, not just for the look, but for the longevity of the garment. I don't want any raw edges because depending on your fabric type, the fabric can definitely fray over the washes. So I don't want any raw edges, especially if I'm going to spend all the time doing the bound edges. The nice thing about this seam finish is it's super easy. It's just a little bit time consuming. So in order to get this finish, we're going to cut 1-inch strips on the bias of whatever fabric we want to use for the binding. So you just cut 1-inch strips on the bias. And this project is extra handy if you have a bias tape maker. So these are really inexpensive. If you don't already have a set, I would suggest getting a set. I have a set of 3, so I have different widths that I can play with. This one uses a 1-inch strip of fabric, and you feed the fabric through the open end, and then you kind of have to adjust it to make sure that it's even. But this little tool folds under the cut edges and gives you a beautiful handmade bias tape. So I love using my bias tape maker in order to create my bias strips. So you can sew your bias tape onto your raw edges either before you sew your seam or after. After, if you have a large enough of a seam allowance, like a 1/2 of an inch or even 5/8 of an inch. So once I have my bias tape made using my bias tape maker, the first thing I'm going to do is take my iron and press my bias tape in half again. So this is going to help us later on once we get to encasing our raw edges. Then I'm going to unfold one edge of my bias tape, then place my bias tape right sides together along the raw cut edge of my fabric, of my seam. And then I'm going to sew that seam using a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Then I'll take my garment to my iron and I'm going to press my bias tape away from my garment. Then I'll wrap my bias tape around to the wrong side of my garment. Then from the wrong side of my garment, I'm going to stitch through all layers, very, very close, like about a scant eighth of an inch from that first seam we made. And that secures all of my layers in place and secures my bias tape down. And there you have it, a beautiful bound seam finish. So whether you don't have a serger or yours is just on the fritz like mine, or maybe you want to take a step back in time and create a beautiful seam finish on the inside of your garment, I hope you found these techniques helpful. If you did, hit the like button and consider subscribing to my channel. And I forgot to mention that today I'm wearing my Manhattan top, which is actually one of my free patterns that I offer. I'll drop the link below. This one was actually made from a scarf, you can see. I really, really love it. It's just light as a feather to wear. And you can shop all of my other patterns over at sewingandthecity.com. All right, that's it for me today. I'll see you soon. Bye.